This is episode 730 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. I am very pleased to be joined this week by Blake Gumprecht. He is a former teacher for the Cuba, New Mexico schools, and he is the author of a very compelling, troubling, but informative article published June 28th in the Albuquerque Journal, an opinion editorial titled Graduating Students Who Don't Deserve to Graduate Isn't the Solution and Ought to Be a Scandal. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Blake Gumprecht.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, well, boy, your article, it really drew some concerns from people who were sending it to me. I hadn't happened to have read it the first day it came out, and then I shared it with Bob Clark on KKOB Radio, who I do a regular interview with every 2 weeks. And Bob, let's just say he got very impassioned when we were reading through your article. Without going into all the nitty gritty, why don't you briefly summarize your article? And, if you want to give some background about yourself and your role there with the Cuba Schools. So I know that's a big question, but there's a lot tied up in that. And why don't you just take that background and run with it?
Sure. Well, I was a teacher at Cuba High School last year, at least part of last year. I am a former college professor. I taught at the college level for more than 20 years. I'm also a former journalist, a writer. I've written 3 books, working on a 4th. My op-ed in the journal used my experience in Cuba as a way to look at one problem in education, public education in New Mexico, and that is disparities between graduation rates and test scores. Every spring, we see news stories that say, hey, graduation rates in New Mexico are going up. That's a good thing, right? Well, not necessarily. That's kind of my point. Graduation rates have risen, but test scores are still pretty awful. What I did is I took New Mexico Public Education Department data, test scores in 3 subject areas for 40 high schools around the state. And what I found was that kids were 3 times more likely to graduate high school on time in 4 years than they were to actually perform at grade level. Most of them are performing below grade level. In the case of Cuba, well below grade level. But yet they're being pushed along, allowed to graduate. And PED likes to show those graduation rates as an example that things are improving, but I question that.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about your background. Are you, and I know this is a sensitive question in New Mexico here, but where did you teach college? How did you wind up in Cuba, New Mexico, relatively isolated rural community there between Albuquerque and Farmington? How did you come to this position? Had you ever taught in New Mexico public schools or university before? Just what level of engagement had you previously had? Because I can imagine if you taught elsewhere and then show up in Cuba, New Mexico, you probably would be very surprised, I think, by the level of dysfunction in New Mexico in generally and probably in Cuba specifically.
Sure. Well, my background's a little complicated. Most of my college teaching career was at the University of New Hampshire. I was a professor there for 14 years. I was also a professor at the University of South Carolina. I taught at the University of Oklahoma. I left academe back in 2017 to return to my first love, newspaper journalism. That was kind of a dumb idea at the time, given the state of newspapers these days. Then during the pandemic, there were no jobs. in journalism, and I happened to be living in Socorro, New Mexico at the time. I became aware of a small Navajo reservation in Socorro that's apart from what we call down there the Big Res, the Alamo Navajo Reservation. And I was curious about it. I'd long been interested in Native groups as a professor. Drove up there a couple times just to check it out. I looked one day on their website and found out that they had openings for teachers. And I thought, I wonder what it would take for me to become a K through 12 teacher in New Mexico. I looked into the process. It certainly seemed doable. I applied for that job. Got it. Taught in Cuba for a little less than a year. Cuba like, or I'm sorry, in Alamo for a little less than a year. Alamo, like Cuba, I discovered that the academic standards are shockingly low. Um,
I'm sorry, Alamo. What is that? A school district?
the Alamo Navajo Reservation is a small Navajo reservation in northwestern Socorro County.
Oh, okay.
If you know where Magdalena is, it's about 30 minutes north of Magdalena. It's about an hour from Socorro. It's very remote. They have their own school there that they created back in the 1970s. So I taught there for about a year, but academic standards were very low there. There wasn't much interest in changing that. I also had a couple of superintendents who treated people badly, so teachers tended to come and go there very quickly. Um, and that was my first K through 12 teaching experience. After that, I gave up on that for a little while, tried to start a freelance writing career down in El Paso, didn't make much money, so I decided to try to teach again, and that's why I pursued that teaching job in Cuba. My experience in Alamo had inspired a significant interest in the Navajo, and I'd begun working on a book about the Navajo. I've been working on that book for about 3 years now. And that was why I was interested in Cuba. That's why I took the Cuba job over a few other offers, because the student body there is about 80% Native, and most of the natives are Navajo.
Got it. Okay, so your article, as you allude to, really discusses the gap between academic performance and graduation rates, and how graduation rates in Cuba were rising, whereas academic performance not so much, and the pressures that you felt. And you also alluded to or cited another educator at the same school district. So talk about, kind of just put some flesh on the bones in terms of the differences you saw between actual academic performance and the students and what they knew versus the pressure that was put on you to pass them through and ultimately graduate them.
Well, I really didn't. I mean, I knew that test scores in Cuba weren't great. Some of that relates to economics, some of that relates to the Navajo. But I wanted to help that. That was my only reason for going there, is a desire to help young Navajo. But I discovered pretty quickly that standards there, academic standards were not high. I discovered that most of my teacher colleagues didn't give homework. They gave out A's like Halloween candy, and they pushed kids through. And that there was pressure from the administration to do that. One of my colleagues, after he began teaching there, he was called into the superintendent's office because he was failing too many students, and was told in no uncertain terms that he needed to change things. And he did what they said, because he frankly didn't want to move again and wanted to keep his job. So he automatically gives certain students a certain amount of points on everything, no matter whether they do anything or not. And his, what his experiences I found were fairly typical. I came in there with high ideals. I thought that students should have to work to pass. I discovered that my expectations were different than other teachers there. Kids just simply weren't used to getting homework, and many of them simply refused to do it. If you refuse to do an assignment, you get an F on the assignment. And if you do that enough, you fail, but that's apparently not what administrators in Cuba want. So I was very upfront with my principal about what was going on in my classes. He said, that's fine as long as you call families and let them know what's going on, which I did. But then the first quarter ended. A lot of my students failed. I was pulled from the classroom. I was charged with unethical behavior. They investigated me, found me innocent of all those charges. It was just a reason to get a way to get me out of the classroom so I wouldn't be grading students anymore. And I never returned to the classroom. They wanted me to do things that I wasn't willing to do. Then they demoted me to a non-teaching position that didn't even require a college degree, basically a babysitting role. I refused that position, so they terminated me.
Yee. Uh, okay, so uh, that's obviously depressing and frustrating. Um, now, I guess I'll ask it this way because it is a tricky issue. And a lot of people in New Mexico say, well, we have these poverty issues, we have these cultural issues that it is difficult, or some would say impossible. And I mean, we're talking about people like, I don't know if you are familiar with the state senator Mimi Stewart. She said famously a few years ago that New Mexico just doesn't know how to teach poor kids, and we do have a fair amount of poverty in New Mexico. But um, what do you think there are specific aspects of New Mexico and its education system? You've obviously taught in other states. New Hampshire is a very different place from New Mexico, but uh, what would you like to see happen in your own school or schools that you've taught in New Mexico? How would you, uh, see them doing things differently and hopefully better?
Well, I think it would have to, I think things really need to change at the top. I think PED, the Public Education Department, is part of the problem. PED in part rate school districts based on graduation rates, and there's a strong culture within PED to encourage school districts to raise their graduation rates, no matter how they do that. I had a colleague at Cuba. This sentence was removed from my Albuquerque Journal article that said somebody at PED told her, we do not fail students." So there's this pressure on teachers to pass students whether they should be passed or not. It really, I think, would take, and I don't know if this will ever happen, a governor who recognizes how serious the problem is, and that a lot of the problem begins with PED, because the schools are not under significant pressure to improve education. They're under pressure to pass more students. We've seen PED's response to the whole Yazzie decision, where the plaintiffs have taken the state back to court because they say PED isn't doing anything to improve education for poor and minority kids. And I certainly saw that firsthand in Cuba. Cuba is certainly an example of why Yazzie happened. And in any sort of meaningful way, education is not improving there. And one of the ironies, too, to me, is that the situation is worst at the schools that need the most help. So my superintendent in Cuba once said to me, well, we have the highest percentage of at-risk students of any district in New Mexico. And I said, well, I understand that. I did my research before I went there. But because you have at-risk students doesn't mean that you just pass them all, that you just go easy on them. If you have a high percentage of at-risk students, to me, that means you need to try twice as hard to educate those kids, to give them opportunities that maybe their parents didn't have. I mean, education is their best chance at a better life, but they're being failed, just like they were in Alamo. If you go to school in Northeast Albuquerque in a relatively well-to-do neighborhood, you'll probably get an okay education. But if you go down to the South Valley or to Cuba or to Alamo, where the most help is needed, the least help is given. And to me, that's, we want to talk about economics in New Mexico. It's hard to really advance economically when your population is not satisfactorily educated, and that's what's going on now. Will anything change? I don't know. I'm somewhat a cynic. I would like to hope that the situation would change, but I'm not sure it will.
Well, so of course, Rio Grande Foundation, as I mentioned, we've been involved in education reform conversations for a long time, and uh, we have studiously avoided really going after teachers themselves. We've always said that the system is the problem. You have a monopoly system with a lot of flaws in the way it works, government funded taxes, statewide funding formula that we think is abused quite often. And I would quite honestly put Cuba among that group of districts that I would say tends to uh, abuse the statewide funding formula because you can do certain things to manipulate the amount of money that is brought into the district. I'm not particularly saying Cuba. I'm saying that Cuba is the kind of district that does these kinds of things. Not that every district doesn't, but it do you did you see a solution like in school choice, or is it an accountability measure like maybe what has happened in Mississippi? And I realize you're not necessarily a policy wonk, but I get the impression from you that the kids are at least showing up. They're interested in learning. They may not be prepared or able to handle the grade level material, but they're not the problem. Is the kids? So talk about, is that a correct assessment, and what are the kind of systemic issues that you think really need to be addressed?
Well, I mean, it begins in some place like Cuba in kindergarten. And, so by the time they got to me, and I had all 11th and 12th graders, you can't fix 11 years of bad education in a year or two. Many of these kids could barely read. Their vocabulary, was probably late elementary or middle school level. I would ask them, okay, read this paragraph. How many words in this paragraph do you not know the meaning of? And there'd be one paragraph in a high school level textbook, and they might not understand 5 or 6 words in that paragraph. So how are they going to understand the paragraph? This really needs to be addressed at a much more sort of rudimentary level. Students need to be diverted into intervention programs. Those students who refuse to do any work need to be put into special programs to help them. I wanted to help every one of the kids there, but there's no incentives for doing that. If you try to push them like I push, you will get ultimately, in my case, you'll get terminated, but certainly you will be talked to by the administration of what you need to do differently. I mean, teachers there are under a lot of pressure. And so most of them give in or they leave. Like my friend said, my teacher friend there said, this is not an educational institution. Teachers either accept that or they leave. I mean, think about that. That's a comment being made by a veteran teacher who's taught 20 or 30 years in New Mexico. And he's saying that about a school. Well, that should be a scandal. This needs to be addressed. We need to quit saying, okay, these kids are poor, so we're not going to fail them. I mean, how does that help them? We need to, in terms of school choice and policy. I mean, I'm a public school guy. Quite honestly. All my education was in public schools growing up in Delaware. I have 4 college degrees, all from public universities. I don't believe that public education in and of itself is the problem. I think public education can work and does work in a lot of places. It tends to work less well in those places that need the most help, whether that's Cuba or New Mexico. I don't personally think school choice is the answer, because I think school choice is going to mostly help kids in better off families. Nobody's going to start a private school in Cuba, New Mexico. There's not enough economic incentive for doing that. Nobody's going to do that in the South Valley. Nobody's going to do that in Alamo. The public education system in New Mexico needs to be changed. rather than these little incremental changes. It needs to be much more drastic, whether that means totally cleaning house at PED, I don't know. But my interaction with PED as a teacher, they want you to do all these little things that aren't really helping the education of the kids in my classroom. This is an emergency that needs to be dealt with at a more basic level. And if you have students who won't do homework, you need to do things differently with them. You need to set up intervention classes. You need to work with them. The answer is not just to push them through and let them graduate on time. Because that results in what we have. Cuba is very poor. Well, part of the reason it's poor, in my opinion, is that kids growing up there get a poor quality education. So how are they going to succeed?
Uh, would you say that, first and foremost, one of the issues that we've had talked about in New Mexico involves kids not showing up for school? Was that an issue, or how big of an issue was that for your kids in either Cuba or other locations?
It was
Alamo.
a huge problem. When I was in Alamo, it was a big problem, but that was during the pandemic. I mean, we struggled to get kids to show up for Zoom sessions. I might, on a typical day, 1/4 of kids might show up. In Cuba, we had horrible attendance problems, and the administration did not do anything fundamentally about it. I was reading something the other day where some school was saying that they had major attendance problem. Oh, this was about a school in Fort Sumner, New Mexico, and they were starting a new program to try to address the bad attendance issue. And they said they call families every single day a kid is absent to find out what's going on. And to try to encourage better attendance. They didn't do that in Cuba. I had kids that would miss 3/4 of their classes. I never got the impression that anybody from the school ever did anything about that. I did my daily attendance like I was supposed to do, but the school is supposed to be calling families if their kids are persistently absent. And yeah, that was a horrible problem in Cuba, and I think that's a horrible problem throughout New Mexico. I mean, somewhat it's a legacy of the pandemic. You hear about that across the country. But when a school district doesn't do anything about that, when there's no real penalty, when those kids still pass, yeah, that's a big problem. Attendance is a big problem in Cuba.
Well, I'm not going to debate the idea of school choice with you or any of that. We'll talk about other things, but I will say that the government approach, it's a monopoly. They don't have the same incentives as a private sector player. And I'm on the board of a charter school, and that's exactly what they do. They do really aggressively reach out to families to make sure that they're attending. You can certainly get government to do better, but I would say that when you have a community, and I'm going to get into the op-ed that was written to counter you by Karen Sanchez Griego in the Albuquerque Journal to follow up your piece. But when it seems to be kind of widely accepted, both at the community level and at the state level, that there's not a lot you can do and a lot of improvement that can be made. I think private sector players can at least bring some innovation and some more TLC, some more engagement with some of those kids. Not obviously a universally successful approach, but certainly a lot more incentive. If the government provides an incentive and actually sticks to it, those private contractors or private providers can do things a little differently in a way that a government institution simply can't or won't. But I don't know if you want to respond to that. It's fine if you do or fine if you don't. But
I mean, I have no problem with private schools, but what I fear is if we have a voucher system that's going to be taking money away from public schools and making it even harder for public schools to succeed. I also think, like I said, those voucher programs are more likely going to benefit kids from better off families whose families can afford to send them to private schools, because oftentimes those voucher programs don't provide 100% of a private school tuition. I don't think that the answer is just to give up on public education, because I think it does work. It can work. I had a job interview. I was offered a job in Corona, New Mexico. Went down there last week. Spent the day there, talked to them. Small school, in the middle of nowhere. Very few students, very few teachers, but I asked questions. I said, what are your views of homework? What are your views about grades? What are your views about failing students? And it was night and day from what I saw in Cuba. And if you look at test scores in Corona, their test scores are good, at least comparatively. Nothing like what you get in Cuba. Not granted, they don't have a large Navajo population, but I don't think that's an excuse. Like I said, just because you have a large native population doesn't mean you just push them through. It means you work twice as hard, in my view. Poor kids who are struggling, you don't just pass them through. You try twice as hard to educate them, to help them. And I think that's possible. I think it is possible for public education in New Mexico to be transformed. But, people in power have to really want to do something about that. They need to recognize the problem. I don't get the sense that they recognize the problem. Yeah, PED increases teacher salaries and thinks that's going to fix the problem. It's not going to fix the problem. They're just throwing money at it. And what happened 5 years ago is still what happens today. Teachers just get paid a little bit more to do it. That's not the solution. So I have nothing against private schools, but I don't think vouchers are the answer. I think the public education system needs to be fixed. And I honestly don't know that there's a more higher priority issue in this state, because education affects everything else. It affects crime, it affects economics, it affects everything, but nobody at the top really wants to do anything about it. And so we're stuck with this system that's not educating kids very well.
Well, we will certainly agree on 90% of what you just said, and disagree on the 10% oriented on school choice. So I'm not going to dwell on that
Sure.
point. But let's focus on this follow-on opinion piece. And you kind of base your article on the gaping difference between graduation rates and actual student performance and outcomes. I mean, there are some what I would call good critiques or good responses and rejoinders to some of the arguments that you make. And then there's this particular article, which was entitled Cuba Graduation Rates Show District is Improving. Now, your whole article kind of discredits the idea that graduation rates themselves are highly relevant because of what you described. But why don't you just provide a few sentences or paragraphs, if you will, in terms of responding to this former superintendent of Cuba Schools, because I don't think she makes any particular points that actually contradict what you're saying. But I do want to give you a chance to respond to what she says.
Well, I feel compelled to begin with by saying that she misrepresented what I said repeatedly. She claimed I said things that I did not say. She made assumptions about me that have no basis in fact. And, she attacked me. I think the article was libelous. I think the Albuquerque Journal was irresponsible for publishing it. I tried to get them to publish a response. They wouldn't. In terms of her basic point that graduation rates show the quality of education in Cuba is improving, I mean, she basically proves my point. During her tenure at Cuba and since, graduation rates have steadily risen, I think, from 60 percentage points, 65 to 95 by her numbers, which don't match the state numbers, by the way. But if you look at the test scores, they're still awful. So all she really does is prove my point, and she tries to put a positive spin on our students are thriving. Well, no teacher in Cuba who was being honest with you would tell you that the kids there are thriving. I don't think most students would agree with that statement if they were being honest. So, her basically she couldn't argue against my points
Right.
legitimately, so she thought she'd attack me.
No, it was not a effective uh, counter to your article. Let me ask you this though. You said you taught in New Hampshire. Now, New Hampshire is an interesting case. Yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with their motto, the Free States,
Live free or
and
die.
yeah, live free or die. And they're a state that at the Rio Grande Foundation, the organization I run, New Hampshire is probably the single greatest model for a lot of our economic policies. They, of course, have a different socioeconomic population, but they have no personal income tax, no state sales tax. They are a state though that really succeeds in a lot of the areas where New Mexico does not. Uh, just kind of from your own personal experience, talk about not so much the student difference, but if you want to talk socioeconomics, feel free. But mostly the way the schools work and different approaches that you think maybe New Mexico policymakers could learn from New Hampshire.
Well, bear in mind that I taught at the college level there, so I
Ah,
didn't
okay.
I didn't teach at the K through 12 level. I did have a son who went through public schools in Portsmouth, and as far as I could tell, got a reasonably good education. Politically, I'm not an expert about New Hampshire. I certainly know its reputation. I know about its taxes. My attitude about taxes in New Hampshire and pretty much any state is if they don't have sales taxes or they don't have income taxes, they just come up with another way to get the money out of you. So your property taxes are really high. Um, I felt like, as a resident of New Hampshire, that there were negative impacts of that, libertarian live free or die approach that New Hampshire has. But New Hampshire is also a very different state than New Mexico. It's mostly white. It has few immigrants. It has relatively few minorities. It certainly doesn't have the native populations that New Mexico did. So it's really hard to compare the two places.
Don't they also fund their education system at the local level? Did that make a difference so far as you could tell?
It's hard for me to tell because I lived in Portsmouth the entire time I was there. Portsmouth is a coastal city with very high housing costs, which means very high property taxes. And so I'm sure the schools in Portsmouth where my son went to school were much better than in less well-off places like Berlin or, working class neighborhoods in Manchester. So perhaps my son benefited somewhat from that. I didn't live in those other places, but they were relatively poor areas in New Mexico or in New Hampshire. Not the dramatic swings you get in a place like New Mexico, but the coast is certainly better off, and so the schools probably got more taxes, and so the schools were probably better. Uh, um, I don't know really what I'm trying to say here, but it's hard to compare New Hampshire and New Mexico. I taught at a university where, 97% of our students were whites. Many of them were middle class. Many of them were out of state because UNH got so little state funding, it essentially operates like a private institution. So that university stayed in business because not particularly academically inclined kids from Massachusetts came up there to get away from their parents and be closer to ski slopes. I taught mostly middle-class white kids. One of the reasons I stopped is because I was tired of teaching middle-class white kids. One of the reasons I wanted to teach in New Mexico is because I wanted to teach people that really needed my help. It would be nice, however, if the schools wanted me to do that. And so far, my experience has been the opposite.
Yeah. Wallet Hub came out with a recent report on public school rankings by state. Probably doesn't surprise you to note that New Mexico was ranked 51st. I went and checked New Hampshire. New Hampshire's ranked fourth on the quality of the school system, fifth overall when they include safety. And, I do realize and appreciate that there are uh, very different demographic trends at play there. But we're also spending in New Mexico vast sums of money uh, and not getting what I would call much of a rate of return on those. And I would love to hear possibly at a future date if you work in Corona. Uh, Obviously that's a different population. As I understand, Corona, it's a much more ranching-oriented community. Demographically, is going to be different, and that is going to play into their results. But if the schools can only do as well as the material they're presented with, and they can't markedly improve upon where those kids start, then we're kind of just wasting a lot of money for not a whole lot of student improvement and outcomes. So it's I mean, I share your frustration and in the difficulty of teaching here in New Mexico and who is happening to manage the school system at this particular point. I think the governor's done a horrendous job, but we can't have a system that only works when a Republican is in office. It has to be a system, in my opinion, that has some level of accountability and ability to really, uh, educate kids uh, year in and year out successfully. And we obviously don't have that in place, and it's hard to see how that system would be put in place. Uh, have you followed what Mississippi has done? They have many of the same challenges as New Mexico, but they've really done I think, a great job within the existing education system of uh, focusing on early childhood reading and moving the needle with their kids. And they even call it the Mississippi Miracle. I just didn't know if you dug into that particular state at all.
A friend of mine, after reading my column, mentioned Mississippi, but it's not a state, quite honestly, that I know anything about. I'm a little skeptical without knowing much about it, just because what I know about Mississippi, and for a long time was a competitor with New Mexico for rankings of 50th. And the question I asked my friend when he said that graduation or test scores have improved in Mississippi because of whatever they're doing, as I said to him, well, maybe they made the tests easier. Um, you know,
Well, we're talking about the NAEP here, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which, by the way, that is what we use at the Rio Grande Foundation, because we believe that kind of objective, non state driven test is the gold standard. And they call it the nation's report card. So uh, I think they've whether Mississippi, you buy into what Mississippi's doing or not. One of the things they've done is to eliminate social promotion in the state of Mississippi, which certainly seems to track with what you're talking about in terms of passing kids on without them actually understanding the material.
well, like I said, I don't know much about Mississippi. I mean, I do think public education in New Mexico can be improved, but the people in charge, whether that means administrators, principals, and superintendents in places like Cuba, whether that means the people who are at the top of PED, whether it means the governor, somebody's got to say, wait a minute, this isn't working. We need to fundamentally change what we're doing. We need to not just keep passing kids. We need to not do social promotion. We need to help those kids who need the most help more.
Yeah.
If you're not classed as a special ed kid, you get kind of ignored and pushed on to the next grade and graduate on time, and then you're poor for the rest of your life because you didn't get an education. I do think it can be improved, but the two schools that I've worked at in here, I saw no interest of the people in charge to really do anything fundamentally different. And I don't see that coming from PED either, but it's not impossible.
Uh,
If Mississippi can do it, New Mexico can do it.
Totally agree with you. we're going to have to wrap things up in a minute, but I did want to ask you about unions and whether unions are a big presence in Cuba or not. They're certainly a very important player in education policy making across New Mexico and across many other states. Did you see them influencing the situation in Cuba one way or the other, or were they fairly trivial in their existence in that district or those districts?
In Cuba, I would say they were very trivial. I sought their help because of the way I was treated, and they were next to no help. We didn't even have a local union rep there, so I don't. They seem to be more or less non-existent there. I don't, I've heard other people blame the union for, education problems in New Mexico. Honestly, I don't have enough awareness of that to know how much they could be blamed. But in Cuba, they were kind of a non-entity.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I think their impact is much bigger in the bigger districts like APS, et cetera. And of course, they also really play a role in policy making and in Santa Fe and with the PED itself. Whether they play a significant role at the local level there is a much more subjective question. So I appreciate your insights there. Well, I know you have a website set up that you do some writing on, and if you want to have people potentially reach out to you and contact you, that's your call. But I'll let you at
Sure.
this point give out any.
I'm welcome to communicate with anybody
Yeah.
about pretty much anything.
All right. Well, share it with everybody, and we can go from there.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
Oh no. What's your website? Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. If you just search by my name, Blake, Blake, last name Gumprecht, Gumprecht, it'll be the first thing that comes up. I don't remember the actual HTML address off the top of my head.
Oh no, that's fine. Yeah. By Googling your name, I was able to find you very quickly and set up
Yeah.
this conversation. So yeah, not many folks. Certainly, your last name, Gumprecht, is not a common name, certainly in New Mexico. So yeah, you're pretty findable out there on the internet. So.
Yeah, I think I'm probably the only Blake Gumprecht on Earth. So
well, thank you very much for your time today, Blake Gumprecht. I appreciate it, and your candor and your willingness to share your own views and discussion with me on this particular interview. And even the disagreements I appreciate as well. So thanks for all you're doing, and we'll keep in touch and see if maybe things go a little more swimmingly in Corona or wherever you do wind up if you stick around New Mexico. So
well, I turned down that Corona job, and Albuquerque schools don't seem interested in hiring me. Somebody who responded to my column suggested that my column might be part of the reason.
All right. Well, best of luck, and we'll see where things go for you. So thanks for listening to this week's episode. Find all episodes at tippingpointsnm.com or at the Rio Grande Foundation's YouTube channel. Subscribe to the show at Apple, Stitcher, or tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.